Hello and welcome to Newswire. I'm Ayza Omar. After 2 months of deadlock, Iraqi President Barham Saleh has appointed Mohammad Tawfiq Alawi as the new Prime Minister of Iraq over the weekend. Now, the protesters of Iraq have outright rejected him, considering him part of the very ruling elite that they are protesting against since October of last year. Now, at least 600 protesters have died in clashes with security personnel, and thousands have been injured in the past 4 months of protests in Iraq. Now, Alawi is not a newcomer to politics. In January 2005, he was elected to the Council of Representatives of Iraq in the Iraqi parliamentary election. He is also the cousin of Ayad Alawi, who founded the opposition Iraqi National Accord and went on to become the interim prime minister of Iraq from 2004 to 2005. Now, Alawi has also served twice, in fact, as communications minister, once in 2006 and then again in 2010. But both times he resigned from his position in protest against then Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's sectarian agenda and political interference. And when he was a communications minister, one of Alawi's key policies was rooting out corruption. He had implemented a policy that imposed very strict anti-bribery terms on every company that had a contract with the ministry. Now, despite of all the history that comes with Alawi, the protesters do not accept him. In fact, protests have continued as a result of this final appointment. Now, Iran on Sunday offered its full support, on the other hand, for the new prime minister, saying that they backed the government's choice and hoped that he would have success. This also comes at a time where the Middle East is ripe with tensions with what is going on between US and Iran. And of course, the assassination of Iran's IRGC commander, General Qasem Soleimani, earlier in January. So keeping that in mind, we want to address the main issue on why Alawi is being rejected by the protesters and whether or not he will be able to carry the torch at this difficult time. Let me introduce who we'll be talking to today. We have Mr. Guy Burton, who is joining us from Brussels. He is an IR expert and also adjunct professor of international relations at Vesalius College in Brussels. Welcome to the show, Mr. Burton. Mr. Burton, Alawi has outright been rejected by the protesters. They say that he is part of the very ruling elite that has corrupted the government system for the past 16 years. What's your take on whether Mr. Alawi is the right person to be appointed at this critical time?
Well, thank you very much for having me on the show again, Ayza. And to answer your question about Alawi and sort of where he comes from, I think, it really seems to be that there's a split in Iraqi politics at the moment, that on the one side you have the political system and the political parties. On the other side, you've got the protests and what's going on in the street. And maybe they felt that Alawi would be a good compromise, because certainly, as you pointed out in your introduction, even though Alawi is part of the political establishment, he was a previous minister in previous governments, but he also resigned a number of times in protest at what those governments did. So perhaps the political blocs felt that this might be a candidate that could reach out to those in the street. And certainly Alawi himself has made clear, at least expressed his understanding and sentiment towards those protesters in the street as a way to try and, ingratiate himself with them. But obviously, as we've seen, that's not really flying at the moment. And a lot of that is probably to do with the nature of the protests themselves. Even though there have been regular protests in Iraq over the last 10 years or so, these ones that have been going on seem substantively different to what has happened before. They're much more motivated by or run by younger Iraqis who have very little political recollection of post-2003, and they are very much committed to a rejection of the system rather than its reform.
Right, and the thing is that Mr. Alawi, though, had resigned during Prime Minister Nouri al-Maliki's tenure. He resigned on the basis that al-Maliki had a very sort of sectarian agenda. And that is something the protesters have gone out and shown in the past 4 months. What analysts are saying is an unprecedented protest because it goes beyond what was historically a sectarian divide amongst the Iraqis. So one would think then that it wouldn't get that kind of reaction that it's gotten from the protesters. Do you think that the protesters are also working on the lines of that if we're shown to compromise right now, that maybe the rest of our demands are not going to be given that importance that they deserve?
I mean, one of the key things is certainly we keep talking about sort of the political system in Iraq as being a sectarian one, and certainly that was set up. But I mean, the nature of the political or the results that have come out of elections in recent years compared to when it was first set up have changed. So, for example, in 2005, the first elections that happened, you had very clear sectarian identity based in parliament. You had a Sunni bloc, you had a Shia bloc, and you had a Kurdish bloc. But at the last elections in 2018, what you had was a split within the Shia bloc. So you have two substantially large Shia blocs that are competing for power, and actually they have taken on board some of the Sunnis and Kurds within when they were standing for election. Now, what is interesting, I think, is that so in a sense, the Shia, who are the majority of the population in Iraq, effectively have consolidated power. So it's very much a sort of a competition within the Shia political system, or at least the Shia-dominated political system. And certainly we saw last month, for example, the Kurds and Sunnis, who sort of stood apart when the vote took place in Parliament to see the American troops withdrawn. But really what we're seeing is, a shift. Even though we have a sectarian political system, there is, tensions and differences within it, within the main Shia bloc as well.
And when we talk about the kind of interest support they're getting now, you talked about the Shia bloc being predominant there. Iran's come out and supported this decision, stood behind Alawi as the prime minister here. Where does the US stand, considering that President Trump had some critical, sort of crucial meetings that got a lot of limelight, got a lot of spotlight there on the sidelines of the World Economic Forum with Kurdistan leaders?
And certainly, the Americans in the past have had pretty much. So you make a very good point about the Iranians being quite a strong presence, and they have been since 2003-05. In effect, they have been very much sort of the kingmakers when it comes to government formation. What is interesting is, in the sense, the Americans have sort of had to go along with it in the past, and in a way, even though the Iranians kind of sort of back whoever has been in power, they backed the previous prime ministers, including Haider al-Abadi. The Americans sort of got on board when it became clear that that this was a political leader who had the support of the wider political process. So I would suspect that presumably Alawi himself is going to have to balance sort of the different factions, the different groups within Parliament in order to maintain, what would be a governing bloc. But as we come back to the point that we discussed before, there is a real rift within Iraqi society now between those who on the street who question the whole legitimacy of the political process. So we've now moved, I think, beyond the idea of the political system being reformable to at least a significant, a growing bloc within the protesters who want to see the whole system taken down.
Exactly, and then that brings in the question that replace it, because if veteran politicians are part of the ruling elite that the protesters say are corrupt and are the reason why the government is in disarray and the people are out of jobs and prices are through the roof, inflation is through the roof, then it really begs the question, who could replace it? It's not just the political system that needs an overhaul, it's the people who would replace it. Because here there's a concern that the US's presence in Iraq, the very reason that the government is in disarray, they can't really find the person the protesters could get back behind, is essentially what they're hoping for, as some analysts say.
Yeah. And I mean, one of the interesting things that came out about a month or so after the protest began, at the beginning of November, the protesters published a proposed roadmap of what could be done. And effectively what they were talking about was sort of taking power away from, the established ruling political elite and putting it in the hands of committees, technocrats who would sort of oversee the process and a reform of the whole political system and the constitution before elections would happen. Now, one of the big problems with that is who would be those people? Who would take part in those committees? Who would choose them? Because at the moment, if it was left to the political process, to the political system, they would pick their own cronies, which of course would be unsatisfactory to the protesters. On the other hand, the protesters, one of the successes of the protest movement until now has been that it's been quite disparate. There are no clear leaders that have emerged, and so on the one hand, it makes it very difficult for the political leaders, the political protest or the political movement or the political society to engage with the leaders because there are none. But of course that makes problems. That then makes problems because how are those people going to become involved in any kind of, change of the system? So one of the things that would be needed would be the creation of political parties and organizations that are coherent and can amalgamate some of these demands.
Demands from the demonstrators, right. And now let me add another to the conversation. Dr. Ahmed Rushdi is joining us from Baghdad. He's the advisor in the Iraqi parliament and president of the House of Iraqi Expertise Foundation. Welcome to Newswire again, Dr. Rushdi. Dr. Rushdi, in an address on state television over the weekend, the newly appointed Prime Minister, Mohammad Tawfiq Alawi, he came out and said that he aimed to project the dawn of a new era in Iraqi politics. And he said that he promised to resign if he is unable to appoint a proper cabinet or take measures to fight corruption. In fact, he even said that the protesters should continue their protests and that he hopes to address these. My question really to you is that why are the protesters rejecting him as well? Were there any other options out there that were not considered that the protesters wanted instead of Alawi?
For my, what I saw in Tahrir Square, I was there today, and I saw what's happened is actually the protesters asking for a prime minister who is not from the political parties, didn't engage with the political process, didn't get any position inside the Iraqi government previously, which already there are 2 or 3 names already presented by the protesters. But the most important thing is that Sairun, which is Muqtada Sadr followers, actually they are engaged again with the demonstrations, try to manage calming down the protesters and try to give time to the new prime minister. Now, how much it will be feasible, how much it will be successful, this prime minister, the Iraqis, I don't think they're going to trust him until they will see something successful, like working on the corruption cases, working to manage new early elections, working hard to reduce the unemployment. All those files already presented in the Iraqi case. Now, the most important thing is that the protesters said is that we don't need someone who should be from outside Iraq. We all know that he came from outside Iraq. He came from Lebanon. The prime minister said that please keep your demonstrations and we work together to end up the crisis of Iraq. But it looks like that I think he will get benefit from the demonstrations to make more pressure on the political blocs inside the parliament to make them accepting him and his government, because we all know that at the end the parliament, we all know that the Iraqi system is parliamentary system, that the prime minister and his cabinet should be accepted by the parliament. So I think he is using the demonstrations to make a pressure on the parliament to accept his nominees for his government.
Yes, because it's a very tight deadline that he's working with. And you talk about that the protesters wanted somebody within Iraq. I mean, he went into exile back in the 70s, right? Because he was wanted by Saddam Hussein then. I mean, he is, at the end of the day, originally an Iraqi representative in the government. And also, he has a track record for standing up for corruption. So why doesn't that work in his favor when it comes to the demonstrators?
Because they don't think that he's strong enough to be successful to manage all those files, important files like corruption.
But Dr. Rushdi, do you think the kind of supporting from Iran at this moment is also going against his favor?
I don't think he is getting support from Iran on a strong basis. I think it's something tactical, because at the end they know very well that he needs to go to the parliament and take the acceptance of the political parties. So in a way or another, yes, he has this. At least the first ignition from the Iranian is that he's okay. He until now didn't get anything, or at least that's what the Americans said. Is that Iraq needs someone like Mohammad Tawfiq Alawi, but let us see what's going to happen after that, because they know very well that he came from Lebanon. And there are some writers. American writers wrote about that, saying that he's the candidate of Hassan Nasrallah. So the Americans are suspecting that he going to make some sort of a success. But the most important thing is that he at least getting the support of Sairun. Definitely, he's getting the support of Sairun, which is also a very important issue in the Iraqi politics. And the irony is in the Iraqi politics always, if you're going to resign, you will get position. And it's always happened like that. He resigned twice. Abdel Mahdi resigned before and become prime minister. Now we have a resigned minister that become a prime minister for 10 years. So just I said, it's some sort of irony in the Iraq politics.
So, Dr. Rushdi, you have highlighted a few challenges that are ahead for Alawi, but just spanning out on the general arena, how the US-Iran tensions are playing out on Iraqi soil, how will they add to the challenges that Alawi is facing, not only on the ground in terms of the protesters' demands, but how he will handle the US troops, which the Iraqi parliament had come out and said resolutely that they need to leave?
Yeah, but the Iraqi parliament didn't make any resolution, didn't make a decision. It didn't make a law. It's a decision, and it's a totally different issue between decision and a law, because the treaty with the US was a law. This is first. Secondly, we all know that we need the American forces because of our let's say international threat like Daesh, like ISIS, and so on. They already presented. We have already 4,000 warriors on the Iraqi soil. Presented in caves and presented in mountains of Iraq. That means the threat is already there, and also the ISIS that presented on the borders with Syria. Mm-hmm. So, but it looks like the Americans now somehow they are managing to move up a file named the NATO. So it looks like the NATO will play a role in Iraq instead of obvious American forces. So you can imagine is that if the NATO will play a major role on the Iraqi soil, it will the American forces will be acceptable. But the strange thing is that the American forces, or let's say the coalition forces, before 1 week, it was adopted by to them move the Iraqi soil and to fight Daesh. And also the other strange thing is that the Iraqi government resigned accepted the existence of Patriot missiles on the Iraqi soil, and without any condemn from the Hashid and without any condemn from the resistance, or as they said, Islamic resistance units. So it looks like that there is some sort of a deal happened between the Iranian and the Americans. Mm-hmm. I don't know what it is, but it looks like there is a deal.
There is a deal,
and maybe, and maybe it's one of the prospects of the deal is the accepting of Mohammed Tawfiq Alawi to be the prime minister.
Okay. All right, Dr. Ahmed Rushdi joining us from Baghdad, in fact. Thank you so much for your time. Coming to you, Mr. Burton, this possible speculation, if you could expand on that, what are your thoughts on what he was saying in terms of not just the NATO presence there, but a possible deal unfolding behind closed doors with US and Iran?
Well, I mean, I'm sure Dr. Rushdi knows more about the possibility of NATO presence in Iraq, but that would surprise me because certainly there's a certain sense of unease, at least in NATO, about further sort of military adventures. I mean, you only have to take, for example, sort of the ongoing war that's happening in Afghanistan, which has sort of sapped and discouraged any kind of inclination to do any more there. Plus, also we have within NATO itself real sort of tensions as to what direction, how much funding. If NATO is there as a sort of a cloak for sort of American presence, I can see how that would be more attractive for the Americans to continue to operate in Iraq. But at least based here in Europe, that seems like somewhat unpromising.
Okay, somewhat unpromising nature is there, because let's not forget when General Qasem Soleimani was assassinated there in Baghdad, it was a lot of NATO members who were pulling out troops from there, saying that the region was in fact escalating very fast and they were being very cautious about their troops on the ground. Well, that's unfortunately all the time we have. Mr. Guy Burton, thank you so much for joining us here. We'll take a quick short break. When we're back, we'll talk a little about what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean. Welcome back to Newswire with me, Ayza Omar. So we'll be talking a little about what's happening in the Eastern Mediterranean. French President Emmanuel Macron, he's sending warships to support Greece in the Eastern Mediterranean. That's the announcement that came over the weekend, where Turkey's bid to claim extensive maritime territory has actually escalated quite a bit of regional dispute, especially because this region is full of energy resources. Now, this is, of course, much to the delight of Greece's Prime Minister, who has welcomed the decisions. And it comes at a very critical time because Greece has been trying to rally support since December. In fact, since Turkey secured a maritime agreement with the UN-recognized government of Libya just at the end of last year, which essentially gave Turkey access to Eastern Mediterranean's precious and abundant oil and gas reserves. Now, Greece Prime Minister says that, who met with actually Emmanuel Macron in Paris last week, says that these vessels that France is sending will act as guarantors of peace amid ongoing disputes with Turkey. So what we're looking at today is, will this be the case, or will France's move to send warships to an already tense region up the ante for regional players here? Let's find out what our guests have to say. We are joined by Mr. Ertan Karpazli, the editor-in-chief of Radio East Med. He is joining us today from London, in fact. Also, we have Mr. Uluç Özülker, a former Turkish ambassador. He was last posted in Paris. He's joining us today from Istanbul. Welcome to both of you. If I could start with you, Mr. Karpazli, this move has come in at a time when tensions are rife, especially after the Berlin summit that was seen early in January. Now, France sending warships, how will this affect the kind of scenario that has built up where tensions are rife between Greece and Turkey?
I don't think France is going to be a guarantor of peace. In fact, France is just going to escalate already very high tensions. We can see that with Turkey's move, with the deal that they made with the Libyan GNA, the internationally recognized government based in Tripoli, that already alarmed many European Union countries, particularly France and Greece especially, because as you may already know, the deal that was struck between Libya and Turkey at the end of 2019 was a demarcation deal to set the boundaries of each country's respective exclusive economic zone in the Eastern Mediterranean. Now, a lot of people may be wondering, well, what does this have anything to do with Greece? Actually, it has a lot to do with Greece, because Greece is arguing that the deal between Turkey and Libya is illegitimate, because that demarcation deal infringes upon Greece's own exclusive economic zone, which is very important for drilling for natural resources, hydrocarbons in the region. Now, with France getting involved, it only escalates the problem, because now Greece has got a lot more gas behind their arguments regarding their rights in the Eastern Mediterranean against Turkey. Whereas if France was to not get themselves involved, Greece would have pretty much no choice but to engage with Turkey in some kind of negotiation about a demarcation deal between Athens and Ankara, which at the moment is non-existent. But with France getting involved, Greece does not have an incentive to actually engage in peaceful negotiations.
Right. So, Mr. Özülker, what Mr. Karpazli is saying essentially that will make the situation worse. And it's ironic because France sending vessels there as peace guarantors, considering that Greece had already rejected the Turkish demand to demilitarize those 16 Aegean islands. And now the French president, who had also said that he was not very happy with the Turkey-Libya deal for obvious reason. He's been backing the Khalifa Haftar government. So your take on whether this will help at all, them moving their warships there in the Eastern Mediterranean?
I don't think that this problem will end with a confrontation between Turkey, Greece, and France. All this is nothing but a psychological effect, creating steps, if you wish. First of all, don't forget that Turkey, Greece, and France are the three of them are NATO allies. and it's impossible for the NATO allies to have a war or a confrontation in this respect. And secondly, I think that this problem arises from the fact that Greece, together with some of its allies, Israel and Egypt, has signed an agreement among themselves for the delimitation of the economic zones in the Eastern Mediterranean, without taking into consideration the rights of Turkey. And there, if I may define it shortly, they're simply trying to imprison Turkey in its territorial waters of 6 miles. And beyond that limit, the main land, as huge as the Anatolia, has nothing to say according to the views of the Greek side in comparison with the islands. And Turkey needs to be imprisoned in its own territorial waters. This is not acceptable, of course. And this problem is nothing but a prolongation of the Aegean problem. As you know, in the Aegean, if the territorial waters are increased to 12 miles, 3/4 of the sea will be an internal sea to Greece, and the warships from Turkey will need a permission from the Greek side to transit the Aegean. So this is not acceptable neither. The best way to solve the problem is to come together and negotiate and try to reach a just agreement which will cover the needs and the rights of both sides. So a unilateral approach is not producing any effect or any result, and moreover, it's creating only new tensions, and with these tensions, it's not possible to achieve anything at all, and none of these countries are eligible to extract the natural gas, which in the end is not for the time.
Mr. Özülker, you're saying that the unilateral approach is basically exacerbating the tensions there in the region. But then I'd come to you, Mr. Karpazli, in terms of how does one move forward from here? Because the situation has gotten bad to an extent that the UN Secretary General, Antonio Guterres, he's warned that these exploratory drillings for hydrocarbon resources of the coast of Cyprus, there are risks of major conflict. And with France entering the picture, can we expect then other allies like for Turkey, maybe Russia, step into the game and worsen the situation?
Well, there's many questions that I need to answer there. But before I really get into each and every one of them, I just want to state that my personal humble opinion is that the intention here on any side is not actually to exploit and extract and export natural gas from the Eastern Mediterranean. There are many experts who have written many reports saying that the proposed pipeline deal that will transport gas from the Eastern Mediterranean and through Greece to Italy to Western Europe is actually not feasible. It's not economically feasible, and it's not scientifically feasible because of the high seismic activity in the Aegean region, particularly, and the depths would just make it pretty much impossible to build and maintain that pipeline. And it would also be not commercially viable to actually export gas to Europe in this way. The same goes for LNG exports as well. Now, what I personally believe here, what really is going on is this pipeline is being used as an excuse by all sides to actually encourage a standoff, to encourage conflict. No one really wants a conflict, but at the same time they do. Because what's going on is Turkey is at this point in time in its history is at a point where if it doesn't start aggressively or assertively rather, asserting itself in its region, it will gradually start declining until it collapses. Turkey needs some kind of confrontation, some kind of excuse to expand its influence, its soft power in the region. And this is something that's very alarming for countries like France or European Union countries who see a Turkish expansion in the region as more of a threat to them than an illegitimate leader in Khalifa Haftar in Libya seizing power. So this is why a lot of the European Union countries, such as France, are actually backing Haftar against the internationally recognized government. Now, where does Russia come into this? Now, Russia also has interests in the Eastern Mediterranean. Russia has been expanding its influence there since the Syrian civil war. Now, I don't believe that Turkey would have had the diplomatic strength to go into Libya without some kind of deal, some kind of guarantees from Russia. So I believe Russia's involved in that way. And Russia, as we can see as a state, they're trying to play a mediatory role in Libya. Now, what I believe is really going on.
Considering Khalifa Haftar, why would they be the sort of support that Turkey needed to get into Libya?
Russia's playing a double game in Libya. We have a lot of Russian mercenaries who have arrived in Libya to support Khalifa Haftar, but Russia as a state is trying to take on a mediatory role. Russia is trying to get themselves into the Eastern Mediterranean because this gas pipeline that has been proposed, should it ever come to fruition, is actually a direct competitor to Russian gas into Europe. And Europe has been trying to diversify its gas imports away from Russia ever since the war broke out in eastern Ukraine in 2014. So Russia does not want any other pipeline to Europe, whether it be from the Eastern Mediterranean or Central Asia or Caucasus, reaching Europe. Russia wants Europe to be dependent on Russian gas, and Russia will use Turkey, if necessary, to hamper or slow down, sabotage even, any efforts to extract the gas from the Eastern Mediterranean to Europe.
That's a really interesting point there, Mr. If I could get your take on this, the feasibility of the economic feasibility of taking this gas pipeline as it is envisaged as the between Israel, Egypt, Cyprus, so on, is been commented by many experts is just not feasible, and that this is, as Mr. Karpazli just said, is a way to provoke Turkey right now. But do you see it that way, that it's the time that Turkey needs to establish its existence, its dominance in the region in light of recent events?
Well, you have to consider these problems in the context of the general Middle Eastern case. Eastern Mediterranean is nothing but a prolongation of the Middle Eastern problem. And Libya as well is nothing but a prolongation of the same problem. So the Eastern Mediterranean actually is at stake among all those states who are willing to extract, to dig and extract the natural gas, but at the same time who are willing to create a supremacy, politically speaking, in the region. So here, the two rivals, Russia and United States, from the point of view of the natural gas as well, one from the LNG point of view, the other one, the transportation by pipeline systems, they are both involved directly in the game. And as much as the Libyan problem is concerned, Turkey has signed an agreement. It's not an agreement in reality, but it's simply a protocol. And this protocol with the government, who's legally recognized by the United Nations Security Council. And now we have our economic zone established as well. And this zone is dividing the connection between Crete and Cyprus, and this is, of course, becoming an irritation from the Greek side. And altogether, I think that what my colleague was saying, his interpretation of the problem is quite right. Russia is playing a double game. I mean, on one hand, Russia is supporting the and on the other side, it's supporting Turkey and saying, "Don't worry, go on." But in the end, as you remember, today in Syria, there has been another confrontation last night, and this is going on to become a fierce battle between the two sides. So the two-sided approach of Russia, not only in Eastern Mediterranean, but generally speaking in all the region, is valid. And I think that I can fully share what has been already said by my colleague a while ago.
I think here you were referring to, Mr. Kerr, what has happened in Idlib just in the past 24 hours. There were 4 Turkish troops, I believe, who were killed in a Syrian offensive there in Idlib, as the Syrian regime is trying to retake an area they've lost for the past 9 years. And of course, Russia is right behind the Syrian regime here. But we saw the rebuttal from Russia, and as it's being interpreted, and Mr. Karpazli, do feel free to jump in here and give us your take, is that the kind of rebuttal Russia has given doesn't seem to show that the two newly formed alliances at any risk here, Turkey and Russia, that is?
Well, I believe that Russia sees itself as the superior in this kind of, I believe it's always been a temporary alliance between Russia and Turkey just to extract mutual interest in Syria. Mm-hmm. And Turkey is not happy with that. Turkey sees itself more as an equal to Russia in this alliance. And Turkey is trying to assert itself as an equal, but Russia is having none of it. Russia doesn't necessarily need to see Turkey as an equal in this alliance because Russia is really a superpower. It's probably the second most powerful country in the world after the USA. So Turkey is trying to, Russia is trying to put Turkey in its place in a way, and Turkey at the same time is going to do its absolute best to secure its defense, basically, against terrorist groups and all sorts of hostile threats that are coming from the region, even if that be at Russia's expense. Now, how long is this going to last? At some point, Russia is going to have to accept that Turkey, the only way they can work with Turkey is to give Turkey something. Right. I think they will have to go into talks, and they'll have to try and figure out, where to draw the lines.
Right. And here, Mr. Özülker, what is the role that the U.S. is playing? Because there was a phone call that took place between President Trump and President Erdogan on January 28th. The U.S. came out with a completely different statement, as Turkey did. They've played a very sort of backbench role when it comes to the Eastern Mediterranean, and especially Libya also. What is your take on right now the priority that President Trump has in the Eastern Mediterranean?
United States, in reality, has 3 different opinions, actually. The first one is President Trump's opinion, and I think that it's closer to Turkey than the 2 others. The second one is the Congress. We know that Congress is reacting against Turkey very fierce. And the third one is the military side. And it seems as if the military side is divided in opinion among themselves. Mm. So as long as President Trump stands closer to Turkey, particularly in his relation with the Turkish President Erdogan, I think that the United States support for Turkey is becoming extremely clear and decisive. And as such, I need to underline 2 things. The first one is that the interest of President Trump in this respect is to cut off as much as possible the relations between Russia and Turkey, because Turkey, from its geostrategic point of view, as much as it's belonging to the NATO alliance, is a trump for the United States, and President Trump is not willing that Turkey gets away from in both ways from the United States.
Right.
So even now, it's 100% sure that United States is also playing a double game. And on one hand, it's vis-a-vis Turkey, it's for and against.
Right.
And for example, when it comes to the Eastern Euphrates, there all of a sudden Russia and the United States come together and decide against Turkey on a joint alliance.
Okay, Mr. Özülker, unfortunately, we've run out of time there, but the crux of it essentially is Russia and the US both have double games because of their interest there in the region. But France's move to move warships to support Greece right now is going to be seen, as we both seem to agree, a provocative move, not helping in de-escalating tensions there. With that, Mr. Karpazli and Mr. Özülker, thank you so much for your analysis. We've come to the end of the program. Tomorrow we'll see you again with a new episode of Newswire, more news and analysis from around the world. Goodbye.